The morning air in a Yorkshire market square is sharp with frost. Your boots slip slightly on the cobblestones, the ground slick and uneven beneath you. Each breath spills out in pale clouds that vanish into the cold mist. But your stomach twists, not from the chill. It's dread. A dread sharpened by the rope itching against the skin of your neck. A halter, rough as the ones used to lead cattle or horses. On the other end, clutched firmly in your husband's calloused hand, is the tether to your entire existence. His voice carries across the square, steady despite the ale he swallowed at dawn. What am I bid for this fine woman? The words echo as though he were selling a cow or a plough, his tone rehearsed and transactional. A ripple moves through the crowd. Some men chuckle, others lean forward, their curiosity piqued. The sound is not of excitement, but calculation. Voices murmuring, eyes assessing. In those faces you glimpse pity, disdain, amusement, but also a strange seriousness, as though what is about to happen is not only expected, but accepted. A few men edge closer. Their gazes move over you as if appraising livestock. They glance at your hands, looking for the hardened calluses that prove you can scrub, cook, and carry water without complaint. They study your face to judge whether you are comely enough to share a bed, whether your hips promise children. One even tilts his head as if he might ask you to open your mouth, to prove your teeth are sound. You stand motionless, every muscle tight, aware that in a few minutes your life may be bound to a stranger, or with some fragile hope, transferred to someone kinder than the man holding the rope. And here lies the bitterest truth. This is no crime. It is no dark alley trade whispered in shadows. In the twisted logic of your time, this may be your only chance at freedom. For most women in early 19th century England, divorce is as unattainable as the moon. The law does not recognize your separate existence. You are not a person in the eyes of the courts. You are property. The roots of this ritual lie in something abstract yet suffocating: coverture. Under this doctrine, once a woman spoke her vows, her independent legal identity disappeared. Her wages, her belongings, even the dress upon her back became her husband's. The celebrated jurist William Blackstone explained it bluntly. The very being of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended, as though she hung invisible from a rope, not unlike the halter that scratches your skin now. Imagine Mary, a working-class woman from Leeds in the 1820s. Before her wedding, she might take in laundry, perhaps earn enough to keep herself modestly. She could even bring a small inheritance from her parents. But the moment she said "I do," her life folded into her husband's. Her earnings ceased to be hers. If she opened a small bakery, every coin went directly into his pocket. If he chose to sell the very shawl she wrapped around her shoulders, the law would not forbid it. It would support him, and should he raise his fist against her, as many men did, the courts looked away. A husband was permitted to correct his wife, just as he might discipline a child or a dog. The bruises on Mary's skin, the broken ribs, the night she went hungry because her husband gambled away their rent, these were not considered crimes. They were the order of marriage. This, then, is why women stood in squares with halters about their necks. For the poor, the system of marriage was a trap, without doors. Divorce in Parliament cost £1,000, a sum as distant as the stars to a labourer who earned shillings a week. Even after the 1857 reforms, a divorce could still cost more than a year's wages. To separate privately meant endless limbo. You might leave, but you could never remarry. To desert meant to vanish, leaving behind children and any hope of security. So, in desperation, communities carved out a grim loophole. If a woman was property, why not transfer her like property? If law refused to grant freedom, perhaps ritual and public witness could. Look again at the square. The rope burns against your neck. Yet the ritual unfolding before these gathered neighbors is not only humiliation, it is also a theater of survival. In the crowd, you spot Thomas, a widower you have spoken to in secret. He is not rich, but his eyes hold no cruelty. The sale is partly arranged. The bids are theater, meant to legitimize what your heart already decided. You know that, if this scene completes as intended, you may walk away with him, free from the man who drags you now by the halter. But until that rope is handed over, nothing is certain. The crowd's judgment is fickle. A higher bidder could disrupt your plan. Your husband might change his mind, swayed by greed or ale. The law offers no protection. Only this spectacle, these witnesses, the unspoken agreement of a community that insists on believing this charade is binding. And yet, hidden beneath the degradation, lies a paradox. In a world where a woman's existence is legally erased, wife-selling becomes, perversely, a grasp at agency. To step into the square, to endure the jeers and appraising eyes, is to gamble that the next life will be better than the last. Some women lost that gamble. Others seized it, even insisting on the ritual when their husbands faltered. From the perspective of today, it seems unthinkable. But to them, in that moment, the halter was not only a symbol of ownership, it was also, strangely, a key. The halter might look like cruelty, but it is really the visible knot of something less visible and more suffocating, the law itself. To understand why men led their wives into market squares, we must first step inside the iron cage of coverture. Under this legal doctrine, a woman's identity did not survive her marriage. Sir William Blackstone's words carried the authority of Scripture. The very being of the woman is suspended. It was not metaphor, it was fact. The moment vows were spoken, she ceased to exist in law. She could no longer sign contracts, sue in her own name, or keep her wages. Her very body was legally absorbed into her husband's. Take Mary Thompson, a typical laborer's daughter. Before marriage, she might take in washing, own a small chest of linens, or receive a few pounds from her father's will. After marriage, those things were gone. Her husband, William, could sell her linens to pay for gin. If she earned sixpence scrubbing floors, the money never reached her hands. It was his by right. Even the dress on her back, or the baby she carried, was legally his property. And William's power extended further still. Should he grow violent, and many did, the law shielded him. Correction, it was called, the same word used for training animals. As long as the blows did not kill her, society shrugged. If William staggered home drunk, if he lost their food money to dice, if he consorted with prostitutes and carried disease into their bed, the law looked away. Mary might bear bruises, hunger, or shame, but she had no legal recourse. Imagine her desperation. Nights when the children cried from hunger while William spent their last shillings in the alehouse. Days when her ribs ached from his temper. Weeks of grinding laundry until her hands split and bled, only for her earnings to vanish into his pocket. And then, perhaps, she met another man. A widower who treated her kindly, or a bachelor who offered affection. To dream of a different life was not weakness. It was survival. But how could she escape? For the wealthy, there was divorce. Yet the price was astronomical. Before 1857, the only way was a private act of Parliament, costing at least $1,000. That is the equivalent of over £100,000 today, more money than most families would see in a lifetime. Even after reforms lowered the bar, a divorce still cost $40, a year's wages for a labourer. So, for the poor, there were only 5 doors out of marriage, and each was either locked or deadly. The first was separation by mutual agreement. Husband and wife might part, but neither could remarry. For a woman, this meant years of limbo, often with children caught in between. The second was desertion. One might simply vanish, slip away at night, disappear into another town, and hope not to be found. But England was not so large, and news travelled faster than people imagined. A woman alone, without a man's legal protection, was vulnerable to poverty, suspicion, and exploitation. The third was church separation. In theory, a woman could petition on grounds of adultery or life-threatening cruelty. But in practice, the process was labyrinthine and costly, and it still left her unable to remarry. The fourth way was death, hardly rare among the working poor. Diseases, accidents, childbirth, all could provide grim relief from a marriage that offered no escape. And then came the fifth, the market square. Wife selling, a grotesque parody of divorce conducted in public with the trappings of trade. It was not sanctioned by law, but neither was it consistently punished. In its twisted logic, it offered something the law refused: a clean break and the possibility of a new life. To our eyes, the scene is brutal, unthinkable. But to Mary, or to hundreds of real women like her, it could feel like the only door not barred shut. Imagine her standing before the crowd, halter biting into her skin. The jeers and laughter must have stung, but perhaps, just beyond the circle of faces, she caught sight of a man she trusted. Perhaps she had whispered with him for weeks, planning this very moment. The humiliation was unbearable, but if it led to freedom, it was a price some were willing to pay. For the men, too, there was calculation. A labourer earning 10 shillings a week could not afford endless quarrels, children without food, or the parish threatening to intervene. Selling a wife was, in a perverse way, cheaper than supporting her. The ritual gave a sense of order to what might otherwise be scandal. It created witnesses, neighbours who could later testify that the wife had been transferred, that the community had seen it, that it was legitimate even if not lawful. And so, beneath the jeers, there was also silence, the silence of recognition. Everyone knew someone trapped in an unbearable marriage. Everyone understood that the law had no mercy for the poor. In that silence, wife-selling became a kind of folk remedy, crude, humiliating, but born from necessity. The rope on Mary's neck was more than rope. It was the visible knot of a system that bound her long before she stepped into the square. The market was only the stage. The real prison was the law. Picture the ritual in its full, unsettling detail. It often began not in the square, but in the newspaper. A small advertisement, nestled between farm auctions and notices for lost livestock, might announce, "John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is strong, healthy, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused." Sometimes the words were colder, almost mocking. "Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands." These notices served a dual purpose. They alerted potential bidders, but more importantly, they gave the appearance of legitimacy. If it was printed in the paper, it must be real. The words mimicked the style of livestock auctions, reinforcing the idea that a wife, like a cow, could be transferred from one owner to another. On the appointed day, the couple appeared in the market square. Markets were not chosen by accident. They were places where property changed hands, where bargains were struck in full view of the community. To conduct a wife sale in such a place was to demand public acknowledgement, to invite neighbours to witness and confirm the act. The wife came wearing a halter, usually rope, sometimes ribbon in a feeble attempt at dignity. It might be looped around her neck, her arm, or her waist, but its meaning was unmistakable. She was property to be led, displayed, and transferred. The crowd understood this language instantly. It echoed centuries of custom, where ownership was signaled by the passing of a halter or a glove. The husband acted as auctioneer. His words rang out across the square, rehearsed, almost theatrical. "What am I bid for this fine woman? She is 26, healthy, can bear children, excellent at needlework, and has all her teeth." The crowd responded like it did at any sale. Men pressing closer, women standing further back, but watching with sharp eyes. Some scoffed, others laughed, but many treated the matter with deadly seriousness. Men examined the woman openly. They looked at her hands, roughened or soft, to judge her capacity for work. They studied her hips and posture, calculating fertility. They searched her face for signs of beauty or fatigue. Sometimes they asked her to speak, to gauge her manners. The process was humiliating, yet within this ritual lay the fragile hope of escape. For the wife, standing under so many eyes, the moment must have felt like standing on a knife's edge. If the sale was prearranged, as it often was, she might know who would bid, who would win. Her role was to endure the theatre until the halter passed to the right hands. If the sale was not prearranged, the terror was sharper. Her fate could be decided by the highest bidder, a man she had never met. The crowd's role cannot be underestimated. They were not passive observers. Their presence conferred legitimacy. They could nod approval, joke about the bargain, or mutter disapproval if something seemed amiss. If the woman resisted too openly, the ritual could unravel. If a husband grew too greedy, demanding higher bids, the audience might turn hostile. Wife selling survived only because the community tolerated it, because people chose to believe the performance had legal weight. And it was performance, a strange blend of parody and solemnity. The halter was more than rope. It was a stage prop, its symbolism heavy. The husband's words echoed the cadence of livestock sales, but with an edge of cruelty. The crowd played its part, laughing, murmuring, sometimes bidding in jest. Yet beneath the surface, everyone understood the stakes. This was not merely entertainment. It was a transaction that determined the course of lives. In some cases, after the bidding ended, a bill of sale was drawn up. Written in clumsy imitation of legal contracts, it might read, "I, John Parsons, in consideration of £6 and 6 shillings, do sell and assign unto John Tucker, Ann Parsons, wife of the said John Parsons, with all rights and demands whatsoever during her natural life." The words mimicked property transfers of land or goods, but here they applied to a human being. Once the halter changed hands, the sale was complete. The new husband might lead the woman away, sometimes to applause, sometimes to jeers. On occasion, the ritual ended in a tavern, with ale and a crude wedding feast. In rare cases, church bells rang, as though sanctifying the grotesque parody of a marriage. The theatre of wife selling was at once grotesque and strangely dignified. It was public, humiliating, and degrading, but also deliberate, ordered, and bound by custom. In a world where law gave no mercy to poor women, this ritual became, however warped, a form of social remedy. Beyond the ritual symbols lies the human drama, moments where the line between humiliation and liberation blurred. One of the most cited cases occurred in Brighton in 1826, when a man led his wife into the market. She was described as a tidy-looking woman, and the bidding was swift. For £5, a fortune compared to most sales, a sailor claimed her. Yet what the newspaper noted most was her expression. She seemed nothing loath to go, and the transaction was conducted with good humor. The truth was that the sailor had courted her for months. This was no sudden betrayal. It was an orchestrated escape, cloaked in the ritual of a sale. In W. Market in 1830, a different kind of story unfolded. The husband hesitated, his courage faltering. Perhaps shame gnawed at him as he stood before neighbors, or perhaps he still felt the tug of possession. But his wife would not be denied. "Let be, you rogue," she cried, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I will be sold. I want a change." Her words rang with a startling defiance, a fierce declaration that she chose this transfer, however degrading the process. The rope around her neck may have symbolized ownership, but her voice was her own weapon. The prices of such transactions varied wildly. At the high end, $100 plus $25 for each child changed hands, equivalent to tens of thousands of pounds today. At the low end, a single glass of ale sealed the bargain. Most fell between a few shillings and a crown. But the money was almost secondary. What mattered was that it happened publicly, with witnesses. The crowd's collective memory gave the act its force. Without witnesses, it was nothing. With them, it became binding. Consider the language of one surviving bill of sale. I, John Parsons, in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid, do sell and assign unto John Tucker, Ann Parsons, wife of the said John Parsons, with all rights, property, claims, and demands whatsoever, during the natural life of her, the said Anne. To modern ears, it is chilling. Yet to those involved, it lent a fragile sense of order. The words of property law were borrowed like charms, hoping to ward off uncertainty, and sometimes the ceremony was followed by celebration. The new couple, along with the former husband, might adjourn to a tavern, where ale was poured and food shared. To outside observers, this mingling of humiliation and festivity was grotesque. But to participants, it was pragmatic. The wife had a new household. The husband had shed a burden. The lover had legitimacy. A toast over tankards of beer marked not only the end of a marriage, but the beginning of another. This strange mixture of degradation and dignity gave wife selling its staying power. It was cruel theatre, yes, but also a practical solution in a world where the law was silent. In every halter passed from one hand to another, there was humiliation. But there was also hope. Not every wife sale followed a script of consent and careful planning. Some unfolded as grim spectacles of chaos, where women were treated less like partners in an arrangement and more like livestock at auction. These moments laid bare the darkest side of the custom. In March 1766, a carpenter in Suffolk sold his wife during a drunken quarrel at an alehouse. He barely understood what he had done until morning sobered him. When he begged her to return, she refused. Humiliated and unable to undo the act, he hanged himself. The sale had not only ended a marriage, but a life, revealing how flimsy and yet how binding these public rituals could be in the eyes of communities. In Manchester, 1824, another sale turned almost farcical. A wife was knocked down for 5 shillings, but she disliked the purchaser. Before the crowd, she flatly refused to leave with him. Embarrassed, her husband put her up for auction again. This time, she was sold for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. Less money, but to a man she found tolerable. The crowd jeered at the absurdity, but beneath the laughter was a recognition that her voice, though limited, mattered. Other cases carried a sharper cruelty. In Sheffield, in 1842, one woman was sold 3 times in a single day. Each buyer changed his mind, and each time she was paraded again, her dignity stripped layer by layer. By the end, the newspaper recorded, she was in tears. The repeated returns underscored the fragile nature of these sales. Transactions with no true legal anchor, dependent entirely on whim and community complicity. The presence of children made these scenes even more painful. Sometimes they were included in the sale, bundled into the bargain like cattle calves. A woman sold in 1865 came with 2 children, each valued at $25 in addition to a price of $100. But more often, children were left behind. Small boys and girls watched their mothers led away by ropes, uncertain whether they would ever see them again. The newspapers rarely recorded their feelings, but the silence speaks volumes. What must it have been like to see your mother treated as property, while you remained behind with the man who sold her? Crowds amplified the terror. A woman might be brave when her sale was prearranged, but if strangers began bidding, her calculations collapsed. Imagine the square when a sale slipped out of control. The husband, flushed from ale, calls for bids. A familiar suitor raises his hand, offering a fair sum. But then another man, a stranger with deep pockets, joins in. The suitor raises again, desperation sharpening his voice. The stranger counters, enjoying the theater. The wife's eyes flick between them, panic rising. She had trusted this sale would free her, but now the crowd is carried by competitive excitement. Laughter ripples, coins clink, and the balance tips toward disaster. Her hands tremble, her jaw tightens. She is moments away from being led into the life of a man she has never met. In such moments, the ritual's thin veil of dignity ripped away, revealing it as raw exploitation. The wife's consent, already fragile, was at risk of being trampled by male pride and the crowd's appetite for drama. The community's role was crucial. Sometimes bystanders intervened, muttering disapproval, pressuring a husband to honor a prearranged sale. Other times they cheered the competition, savoring the spectacle. The crowd was both judge and accomplice, shaping outcomes through its reactions. For the women trapped in these chaotic auctions, the halter was not merely symbolic. It was a chain linking them to an uncertain fate. In the best cases, it passed to a man they had chosen. In the worst, it dragged them into yet another cage. The practice of wife-selling was not scattered evenly across England. It had geography, economy, and culture etched into its very pattern. Yorkshire stood out most starkly. Of the 108 documented Victorian-era cases, 27 took place there. Industrial towns like Halifax, Huddersfield, and Sheffield, where poverty pressed hard and social structures strained under rapid change, produced fertile ground for the custom. By contrast, in the prosperous southern counties, wife-selling was rare. There, farming families clung to older patterns of community oversight and greater economic stability. Scotland all but ignored the practice thanks to its distinct legal system. Scottish law, unlike English, allowed certain forms of separation that gave women slightly more leeway, making the market square ritual unnecessary. Economics shaped everything. In industrial Yorkshire, men and women often worked separately, in factories, mills, and workshops, eroding the old sense of family as a single economic unit. With less shared labor, marriages fractured more easily. When violence, poverty, or infidelity broke bonds, there was no church or court solution accessible to the poor. So the market square became a substitute courtroom, a place where broken marriages could be settled in view of neighbours. But this was never a law in the eyes of Parliament. Magistrates, when faced with a sale, often wavered. In 1819 at Ashbourne, Derbyshire, a local magistrate tried to halt a wife's sale. The crowd turned on him, pelting him with objects and driving him away. Later, the magistrate admitted his doubt. "I do not think I have a right to prevent it, because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, of which perhaps it would be dangerous to deprive them by any law." His uncertainty shows how deeply entrenched the ritual was, and how dangerous officials felt it might be to tamper with popular tradition. Sometimes officials even encouraged the practice. In 1814, Henry Cook of Effingham was pressured by poor law commissioners to sell his wife rather than burden the parish with her upkeep. They arranged her transport to Cudden Market, where she was sold for a shilling. The parish even paid for a celebratory meal afterward. To them, wife selling was not scandal. It was fiscal policy. The location of the sales mattered as much as the act itself. Market squares were not random. They were the beating heart of commerce. Livestock changed hands there, as did grain, cloth, and tools. To sell a wife in that same space was to place human relationships inside the framework of trade. It lent the ritual a veneer of order and legality. In medieval English law, one of the oldest recognized forms of property transfer was livery of seisin, where goods were handed over in sight of witnesses. Wife selling, with its halters and crowds, echoed that tradition. Mock legal theatre, performed in public to secure a kind of legitimacy. The crowd functioned as both witness and enforcer. They expected the sale to follow unspoken rules. The wife should not be dragged against her will. The husband should not inflate bids beyond reason. The buyer should be someone broadly acceptable. When those boundaries were crossed, the community could intervene. There are accounts of jeering crowds disrupting sales if they felt the woman was being mistreated, or forcing the husband to accept the buyer the wife preferred. This balance between cruelty and consent made the practice strangely durable. It was neither purely barbaric nor entirely consensual. It was both, shaped by the pressures of poverty and the invisible hand of community judgment. The marketplace, the magistrate's uncertainty, the parish official's complicity, all of these threads reveal the deeper truth. Wife selling was less about law than about custom. It persisted because local people believed in it, because it offered solutions where the state was silent, because communities accepted the halter as a symbol of legitimacy. But as the 19th century advanced, these very forces, economics, law, and public opinion, would begin to shift, and with them, the ritual itself. By the mid-19th century, the winds of change were blowing against the practice of wife selling. What had once been tolerated as rough community justice began to look, to many, like a public scandal. The growing Victorian middle class, with its obsession for respectability and domestic privacy, could not stomach the sight of wives paraded with halters around their necks in front of laughing crowds. Newspapers reflected this shift. Where earlier reports had been neutral, even amused, later coverage dripped with condemnation. Accounts described sales as disgusting exhibitions or brutal scenes unfit for civilized society. The very language signaled a change in moral temperature. To the respectable classes, wife selling was not just degrading for the women involved. It was an embarrassment for England itself, a blot on the national image of progress and civility. The law, though slow to respond, eventually followed. Courts began to prosecute cases more vigorously. Where once a seller or buyer might receive only a token fine, by the 1860s, sentences of several months in prison were not unheard of. Prosecutors charged men with conspiracy to commit adultery or bigamy, even if the community had treated the sale as binding. The gap between local custom and national law widened until the ritual could no longer sustain itself. And yet, even as the practice declined, it lingered in altered form. Instead of public auctions, couples began to arrange private deeds of sale, signed in back rooms or taverns, mimicking legal contracts. The halter and the marketplace disappeared, but the desire for some form of binding separation remained. Communities still whispered of such transactions, though the days of cheering crowds were fading. At the same time, wife selling became a topic of entertainment. The music halls, those bustling theaters of comedy and song, seized upon the ritual as fodder for humor. Popular ballads poked fun at foolish husbands, nagging wives, and gullible buyers. The grim reality of poverty and desperation was scrubbed away, replaced with caricature. In one comic refrain, a husband boasts of selling his wife only to discover she returns home each night anyway. A harmless prank, rather than the shattering humiliation it truly was. This transformation of tragedy into comedy was telling. Middle-class audiences preferred to laugh at the working-class custom rather than confront the misery that produced it. The ritual that had once provided desperate families a way out was trivialized into a joke, entertainment for those who never needed it. Alcohol's role in the practice deserves mention here too. Many sales began in taverns, fueled by ale and the camaraderie of men who found temporary courage in drink. Beer or gin blurred the edges of shame, making the unthinkable seem possible or amusing. When questioned later, husbands often blamed the bottle. Some tried to reclaim wives after sobering up, insisting they had not meant it. But the community, once it had witnessed the halter passed and the price paid, treated the act as final. Drink might excuse a blow in the home, but not the public theatre of the square. By the late 1840s and 1850s, evangelical movements joined the chorus against wife selling. The Salvation Army and other reformist groups preached about the sanctity of marriage, portraying the ritual as evidence of sin and moral decay. Yet even reformers were not immune to the weight of economic necessity. In 1889, one Salvationist in Nottinghamshire sold his wife for a shilling. Preaching ideals was one thing, surviving reality was another. Thus, in its last decades, wife selling existed in a strange twilight. Public markets gave way to private contracts. Community amusement shifted to middle-class ridicule. Courts cracked down with harsher penalties, and reformers denounced what they could not always prevent. The practice was weakening, but not yet extinct, clinging to life in the gaps between law, poverty, and custom. Though rooted in England's working-class struggles, wife selling was never entirely confined within those boundaries. It sometimes crossed the rigid lines of class, and its reputation spread far beyond the country's shores. One of the most surprising stories comes from the aristocracy. Around 1740, the Duke of Chandos reportedly encountered an innkeeper savagely beating his wife. Outraged, or perhaps intrigued, the Duke offered half a crown for her. The innkeeper accepted, and the Duke later educated and married the woman once her first husband had died. Their marriage, by all accounts, was affectionate. On her deathbed, she gathered her household to confess her history, drawing from it a moral of providence and patience. For critics of the custom, this tale was both scandalous and oddly redemptive. Even a duke might participate in the ritual, and even such a sordid beginning could end in respectability. The practice also traveled across the Atlantic. English settlers carried the custom to America, where colonial records show instances of wife sales in places as far apart as Connecticut and South Carolina. In some cases, the ritual was even more formalized than in England, complete with bills of sale and public notices. Though rare, these sales reveal how adaptable the custom was, clinging wherever the law offered no relief to struggling families. Abroad, however, wife selling became an object of fascination and ridicule. French newspapers seized on the ritual, reporting lurid accounts of Englishmen leading wives to market with halters around their necks. Political cartoons depicted John Bull, the national caricature of England, dragging a weeping woman like a cow, while smug Frenchmen mocked the barbarity of their island neighbours. To French readers, the practice confirmed every prejudice. The English were coarse, mercantile, and hypocritical. For Britain's elites, such attention was mortifying. At a time when Victorian leaders sought to present their nation as the moral torchbearer of Europe, champion of industry, civility, and Christian virtue, the spectacle of wife-selling threatened that image. How could a country that prided itself on progress allow such scenes to unfold in its market squares? The embarrassment only strengthened efforts by reformers, journalists, and officials to stamp out the custom. Colonial echoes, aristocratic anomalies, and continental ridicule. These threads show how wife-selling was never a simple working-class curiosity. It touched every level of society and reverberated far beyond England's borders. What began as a desperate folk solution in rural markets became, by the 19th century, a stain on the nation's international reputation. By the mid to late 19th century, the ritual of wife-selling was withering under the combined pressure of changing laws, shifting morals, and new economic realities. What once seemed like the only escape from an unbearable marriage was slowly replaced by alternatives that, while still imperfect, at least existed within the framework of law. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to chip away at the iron grip of coverture. For the first time in centuries, wives could legally keep their wages and inherit property in their own names. These reforms did not erase inequality overnight, but they opened cracks in the walls that had trapped generations of women. Divorce, too, became more accessible. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 had already transferred divorce from Parliament to the courts, and though still costly, it gradually became a real option for more than just the elite. Meanwhile, the broader economy was transforming the lives of the poor. Industrial wages, though meagre, gave women a measure of independence. A woman who worked in a textile mill or a factory could, in theory, support herself outside of marriage. Railways made it possible to leave abusive husbands simply by vanishing into another town, something far harder in earlier generations. Urban anonymity, too, offered cover that rural villages could not. The social web of neighbours and parish officials, once tight enough to bind couples together, began to fray. Cultural attitudes shifted alongside. Romantic ideals of marriage, mutual affection, companionship, love, spread down through all classes, making the idea of selling a spouse not just shameful, but grotesque. Middle-class reformers, evangelical preachers, and journalists together recast wife-selling as a relic of barbarism, not a tolerated custom. The last documented sale in England came in 1913, when a woman testified in court that her husband had sold her to a workmate for a single pound. By then, such stories provoked outrage rather than amusement, and yet, in its dying years, the practice still carried meaning. It reminded people of the system that had forced it into existence. Wife-selling was never simply a cruel game of men disposing of unwanted wives. It was, at its core, a desperate attempt by ordinary people to solve problems that the law refused to address. In that sense, it was both grotesque and strangely rational. To stand in a market square with a halter around one's neck was to endure humiliation so that something larger could be achieved. Escape from violence, a chance at affection, or simply survival. Some women insisted upon their own sale, seizing the only sliver of agency available. Others endured it silently, praying their new lot might be kinder. All paid with their dignity for a chance at freedom. From our vantage point, it is easy to recoil. But the halter was more than rope. It was a symbol of law's failure, of a system that reduced women to property and offered no remedy for their suffering. The marketplace became a courthouse, the crowd became witnesses, and the act, half theatre, half transaction, became justice of a kind. Today the halters are gone. The squares are filled with shops and cafes, and divorce is a legal right rather than a privilege of the wealthy. Yet the echoes remain. They whisper questions we cannot ignore. What happens when systems fail to provide justice? How do desperate people create their own remedies when the law abandons them? The women of Victorian England, who stood with ropes around their necks, deserve more than pity. They deserve remembrance. As human beings who endured the unendurable, who sought freedom with the only tools they had, who remind us that progress is fragile and rights hard-won. Their stories, though bound in humiliation, also pulse with courage. In remembering them, we honor their struggle, and we confront the uncomfortable truth that societies, then and now, are often judged not by how they protect the strong, but by how they treat those left with no good choices at all.